So I always have this as a sort of trigger point for whatever I do. I always think about this. Bearing in mind there's different types of engagement, looking at research priorities is quite important to decide whether what you're going to do. You're going to look at it from a personal perspective, or a group or team perspective, a collaborative perspective, multi-centre or multinational perspective. And of course there is a variation in scale and complexity of the possible impact and benefits of research, and they can be local, regional, national or international. And I think if you are developing research priorities, you need to think about what the impacts are that you're hoping to achieve and plan those early on. We know that there are lots of advantages of researching, so getting the right research questions or the right research topic areas are actually quite important, but these are just a few of the ones that I often think about, and I'm sure you've probably got a few more that you think about too. We've been working in this health culture within the NHS since about 1991, when this primary objective was thrown out to everybody in the NHS to make sure that research and development becomes an integral part of healthcare, so that practitioners, managers and other staff find it natural to rely on the results of research in their day-to-day decision making and longer-term strategic planning, which is an interesting quotation, and I'm not sure still where we are in terms of that development, but hopefully the research priorities can actually move that forward. I really think about research in a very basic way, so it's any activity that's undertaken to increase knowledge, systematic investigation of a problem, issue or a question. It comes from a very early definition, but I think it's open enough so it doesn't put people off. This is a poster that actually was part of my professorial inaugural lecture in 1999, and you can see that the title was On the Road of Experience, and at that point I was talking about physiotherapy on the road of experience in terms of research activity, but I was also talking about my own experience of research activity. And you can see that photograph in the corner there. Where is it? And that's before I had my horns taken off. And I had nearly black hair then, so you can see lots of changes since I moved on. But at that time in 1998, the profession of physiotherapy was still really in its very early stages of research evidence development, and I was one of the sixth, I was the sixth physiotherapist to qualify with a PhD in 1990. And if I tell you now that registered with the CSP, there's probably about 500. But actually that's probably not all the people who've got PhDs in the profession of physiotherapy. And I know that there are similar sort of trajectories in other professions. But for me, it's important that the professions move forward in terms of their research development. Here's the evidence-based authority now. This is based on Sackett's model, which was adapted by Berry and Mead a little later on. But actually, what this model misses out is all the underpinning research that needs to be done to actually underpin research that takes place to look into, in detail, and look at practice. So hopefully there will be a new potential model. We're doing some work on that now at the CSP. We're trying to develop a new model based on discourse analysis of issues relating to evidence. So if we look at the state of evidence, and I'm giving physiotherapy as an example, Mosley et al. Did a survey and identified the extent of evidence from systematic reviews and randomised controlled trials in physiotherapy. And this was quite early, you see, it was published in 2002. And they used the PEDRO database. They found 332 systematic reviews and 2,376 RCT papers. But when they looked at the evidence, they were really surprised about the quality of the studies that went through. And actually, if you read RCTs these days, it often makes you query where these people have got the ideas from and why they've actually gone ahead with the sort of models that they've utilised. But they found that musculoskeletal physiotherapy papers were actually the strongest out of the group. I think these are challenging times, so there is a need for strong professional evidence bases, no matter which profession you're in, and a combined evidence base, which is multi-professional, is even better. The time for engagement in research by clinicians is actually becoming more and more difficult to procure for various reasons, but largely because of NHS savings, cuts in jobs, increases in numbers of patients, etc. And this is also due to the challenges and timescale of the NHS ethics and governance approval system, which does put a lot of clinicians off in terms of applying for research ethics and governance to do their research. And because of this, a lot of undergraduate programmes, and this may be the same in other health professions, have actually withdrawn dissertations from their undergraduate curricula. They're still doing research, but they're not actually doing massive projects and massive dissertations anymore, which is a bit worrying, because in the future, are clinicians actually going to think that research is part of normal practice? It's a little worrying. So the individuals who are most likely to engage in research are clinical academics, academic staff, research staff and postgraduate students, but not necessarily clinicians at the moment. We need to get more clinicians on board. So we do need to make the best of any opportunities there are for research to take place. And the thought was, when we started on our first research priority project, that research priority lists could be helpful in increasing the critical mass of research in particular areas. We also need to populate the evidence base as soon as possible to maintain the credibility of all our professions, and that's why we undertook the first priorities exercise. So, why research priorities? Well, they are really there to establish identified gaps in the evidence base from experts' perspectives and maximise any opportunities that there could be in developing an evidence base. So our first study, and I have to acknowledge my collaborator, Alison Rushton, who actually took the lead on this particular study, was looking at the international identification of research priorities for postgraduate theses in musculoskeletal physiotherapy, and we used a modified Delphi technique. There have been a few other studies that have looked at research priorities internationally, and these are a few of them. And Nadine Foster, as you'll see, the second one down, used a nominal group consensus technique and identified 7 areas, 7 priorities in the UK for future clinical trials. And I gather Nadine Foster's been here to do a session, hasn't she? Well, she has. I saw her flyer, so I know she has. So there hasn't been an awful lot done, but both of us argued that there was a gap in the development of research that links first-time researchers, and for many people around the world this is postgraduate students, in gaining a worthwhile experience and enabling them to address meaningful questions that could form the basis for much larger funded studies, particularly if they're published. And publication and dissemination of findings is another issue, but we won't talk about that tonight. So across the world, there's quite a large number of postgraduate theses undertaken in the field of musculoskeletal physiotherapy, which is my speciality field. Sorry, go back. And IFOMT, which is the International Federation of Manipulative Physical Therapy, actually has a series of defined standards. I think there's about 200 defined standards for each course that's run across the world. And a research project is definitely a requirement for those particular people who are taking up those courses, which are approved postgraduate studies. So we got together and we decided to actually develop a method, a list of priorities which would be sensible to use across an international audience So for all the postgraduate physiotherapists who would be studying for an IFOMT qualification, recognised qualification. So we use the Delphi method, and the Delphi method is an example of a consensus technique. There's the definition: a method for systematic collection and aggregation of informed judgments from a group of experts on specific questions or issues. And it's been previously used by a range of people, but not in our areas. So what we did was we set up we set out to gain a large international consensus using a reasonably large sample. And if consensus was obtained, this would demonstrate evidence of face and concurrent validity of the research priorities. So we used a modified Delphi process, which means that instead of having a single focus for each round of the Delphi process, normally there's a series of 3 rounds in a Delphi process, we actually had an explicit focus defined for each round of the data collection process. So we had 3 rounds. And there was an iterative process at each round. During the process, the participants could alter or develop their opinions and give feedback to other participants in the group by sending qualitative responses. And this therefore provided us with quite a lot more data than simply using consensus techniques. And Ali Rushton and I remember sitting in the hotel adjacent to Victoria Station for many hours looking at the qualitative data and actually analysing that to reasonable effect. The participants, as you might guess, should be experts in their field, and so what we did was we chose postgraduate course tutors who had expertise in facilitating and supervising postgraduate theses and also had awareness of the current evidence base, and you'll see in a few minutes why that's important, because I'll come back to that. The expert clinicians on MSK were also involved, and they were expert as viewed by the manual therapy organisations in their specific country. So the participants who were involved were nominated by 10 out of the 20 IFOMT organisations, and we ended up with 91 participants. The members were identified through a purposive sampling, and each nominated individual from their host country received a letter of invitation and details of the procedures, and we included all these countries, so Australia, Austria, Canada, Germany, Italy, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, UK and USA. We did leave out some of the less well-developed country organisations in order that we could focus on the expertise that had developed in these recognised countries. So we got ethics approval from Birmingham University, which is where Ali Rushton is based. And the procedures. So what we did was we carried out the process by email, and you'll see we've moved on from that in subsequent studies, and people were given the opportunity of responding by post if necessary and if requested. I think only one participant actually requested paper formats. And in round 1, what we did was we requested that each participant identify 10 research priorities in musculoskeletal physiotherapy. And we also requested comments on how easy it was to develop these 10 priorities. And there was also space to provide other qualitative information. And the two of us, Ali Rushton and myself, analysed the data independently, and then we got together to collate the analysis. In round 2, we provided feedback in the form of themes and sub-themes to all the participants from round 1. But this gives you an idea of the sort of themes and sub-themes that we had. So major themes related to all these titles on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we had a series of sub-themes, and I won't go through all these because I don't think that's necessary. But if you're interested in this area, if you are a musculoskeletal physiotherapist or you're keen to collaborate with musculoskeletal therapists, then the article has been published in Manual Therapy Journal, so you can obtain it through the Manual Therapy website. We also had, this table represents the rating of importance of each theme, and this shows you what we did in terms of developing a rating system. We looked at the mean score, we looked at the standard deviation, and we looked at the coefficient of variation. And I'll tell you what the scores that we chose were in a few minutes. We also offered each of the participants the opportunity to consider 6 principles of good practice, which we established in the first round. So we asked them, you know, what do you think are the principles of good practice that we should be getting across in order to develop the priorities further? And these are the principles that actually they agreed on. So the procedures in round 2 and in round 3 actually, they were requested to rate the importance of the themes by using a 1 to 5 Likert scale, and the level of consensus was established at a mean rating of equal to or greater than 3.5 and a coefficient of variation of less than or equal to 30%. In round 3, all the participants were provided feedback on round 2 through continued use of the themes, and identified 159 topic areas derived from round 1 and also from round 2's comments. And then they were again asked to rate the importance and feasibility of these research topic areas. And we established consensus just as we did for round 2. So the findings in round 1, we had 30 participants and 42 clinical experts who were invited. 24 of them and 38 clinicians responded. And in round 2, we had 61 participants, so 67% response rate, and we had a good census of agreement. We removed 8 themes which were below the consensus level. In round 3, we had 58 participants, and they rated the importance and feasibility of research question area, and again the consensus agreement was good. So in the end we agreed on 43 research question areas which were deemed to be important and feasible, and we used the same means and the same coefficient of variations in order to do that. And so these are the research question areas. So there's a theme of professional development, there's another theme of epidemiology, and another theme of reliability of assessment tools, also validity of assessment tools and outcome measures, and also examination, assessment and diagnosis, which was another theme. And finally, classification, subgroups and profiling of common syndromes, mechanisms of action of treatment, evidence-based practice and patient-focused research. So there was quite a lot of themes and lots of sub-themes there. So these are the research question areas. They are not specific research questions, and anybody who's supervised, how many of you are doing doctorates? Okay, how long did it take you to develop your research questions? A long time, yeah. I mean, it can take some of our Prof D students about 8 months to develop a research question. So these are research topic areas. They are not defined research questions, and we felt that this was important to offer very broad areas so that people could develop closely identified research questions on the basis of that. But you could do it in a different way if you wanted to. The important thing that we needed to recognise was the fact that we were dealing with musculoskeletal therapists from across the world. But the important thing is, if we could get some of these research topic areas answered, then it would do the profession a lot of favours. So that was the first study. On the basis of that study, we were approached by the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy, who I do quite a lot of work for anyway, who wanted us to then identify national research priorities for physiotherapy. And again, we used a modified Delphi technique, but we used a slightly different process. And the important thing about this is to recognise that there are, well, if you ask physiotherapists, they'll say there's probably about 56 different specialities in physiotherapy. You can narrow that down to about 46. You can actually narrow all that down to about 6 speciality subgroups, okay? But there are a lot of individual specialities to recognise within the profession. So we moved on this one. This is the one that's been published relatively recently, 2012. The CSP, interestingly, had carried out research priority exercises in 1997 and 2002, but what they simply did was to use an expert panel and used a nominal group technique. So one panel to devise a whole series of priorities for so many, 51,000 physiotherapists. And if you look back on these, it's quite interesting to see how the profession has developed. Because in 1997, if you look at the research priorities, or the topic areas then, they were completely vague, really, really vague. So it might have been, we need more research in cardiopulmonary physiotherapy, you know, okay. We need more research into back pain, yeah, okay. So actually, but as you look at the research priorities and you go to 2002, they became much more specific and much more tailored, but they still weren't as tailored as the ones that we got in the 2012 exercise. Because the profession's moved on, there's more expertise there, and actually there's been quite a lot of research done. So it shows the maturity of the profession in a number of different ways. So in the design of this study, this time we used SurveyMonkey instead of just email, which was good. We used a modified Delphi method again, and we had 3 rounds. So in the first round, and I'll talk to you about who the participants were in a minute, because that's quite important. We requested 5 priorities to be established from each participant, and we used a predefined prioritisation criteria. And we asked that each of the priority areas was accompanied by a supporting statement. We used content analysis to actually look at the supporting statements and to identify the themes and the topics, and there were 4 of us involved in that analysis. In round 2, we asked the participants to rate the importance of each topic using the 1 to 5 Likert scale. And in round 3, we requested a further process of rating, and qualitative data informed our decision-making process. And there was a very similar level of consensus set for the choice of the research priorities as we did in the first study. These are the prioritisation criteria, and I won't go through all these, but they will be available to you. But it's very important that actually one looks at the need to fill a gap in the evidence of the profession, what the potential impact of the research could be, and as everybody knows who's been having something to do with the ref, and I know you're all gearing up to that now, I would assume, as we all are, impact is going to be a big thing. In 2020, you know, I don't think we'll be seeing anything else but impact, actually. So we need to be taking that on board. So we asked people to look at that. And we also asked them to think about what the burden of disease was, and potential impact of the research on practice and on managers. So these were sent out to all our panel members. We used a different mechanism. We had a different arrangement for participants in this particular study. So we had 4 steering groups, each with 12 members. So the 4 steering groups actually included people, experts in the 4 different fields. And I'll tell you what those were in a minute. Well, they were at the top actually. So they were musculoskeletal, neurology, cardiorespiratory, mental and physical health and well-being, which we tried to incorporate all our 55 different specialities into, which actually worked reasonably well. So the steering group actually had 12 members, each with 12 members, but there were different sizes of steering groups for each of those those panels that we've got at the top. We included a range of stakeholders, and as you can see, it included practitioners, but it included researchers, educators, managers, commissioners, policymakers, guideline panellists, users, charities, patient organisations, and there were 1 or 2 people from the NHS. So overall, we had 204 participants in our expert panels. And for the original steering group members, we actually requested a CV from them because we wanted to make sure that they were actually knowledgeable and expert in their area of practice. So we developed a table which showed the background of each of the expert panellists so that we could actually see where they were coming from, and if there was any discrepancy in their voting, then we could actually look at where their particular expertise was. And the findings, well, we had a response rate of 53 to 78 across each of the 3 rounds. And the identified topics were, as you can see. So we identified 24 topics that needed to be taken forward in musculoskeletal, 43 in neurology, and 30 from cardiorespiratory and medical rehab, and 30 from mental, physical health and well-being. And all these priorities are now on the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy's website, so you can access them from there. We gained consensus for most of the topics, and the measurement of the validity of the research topics was good. I think it's important that we had multiple stakeholders involved because that actually increased the credibility of the study, and it did actually sort of raise the profile of what we did. And I think the key stakeholders took actually a lot of information back from the discussions to their own groups. So that was a second study. We then embarked on a third study in osteopathy, and I have quite a lot to do with the field of osteopathy. I can't really give you much in the way of findings for this because the study's still in process. We're still in round 3 and we're still waiting for consensus to be formed. But we used a similar process to the 2 previous studies. However, osteopathy, I don't know, is anybody here an osteopath? Anybody know about osteopathy? Interesting that they are at a different stage of their evidence development. So I would say they're probably 20 years behind physiotherapy, but they're speeding up pretty quickly. However, and I mentioned this before, there have been certain issues raised. It was quite difficult to identify experts relating to research evidence in the field. And so that actually probably biased opinions. We had quite a lot of quite sort of nasty comments from some of the osteopaths who were involved because they couldn't see the point. They couldn't agree with their colleagues because they were saying, well, why do we need this? Because this has been done in a different field. But other experts, who are so-called experts, had put these ideas forward, because they're all put forward by the people who are on the panel. So the other issue is that there is a lack of evidence in osteopathy, but there's quite a lot of evidence that can be taken in that's transferable from other fields. But I don't think many of them recognise that. And I think there's a lack of recognition by osteopaths of research evidence that's relevant to their practice, that's generated by other fields. The research culture is not yet fully embedded in their profession, but it is growing. And at the moment, we have a consensus, but we've only got, I think, about 14 areas of priority. But we are still working on that, and we are going through another round as it stands at the moment. So I can't really report on the findings, as they're still under consideration. But I think it gives you an idea. You know, we've learnt a lot from this osteopathic one. You could probably do with a smaller group who are actually profound experts in their field, and there are experts in osteopathic research. But people who were put forward by various stakeholders assumed that the people that they put forward were experts. So the thing that we did with the physiotherapy study, I think, you know, getting their CVs, making sure that they're really that the people are put forward by people who really understand whether they've got expertise or not, is very important. I think we'll be all right with the osteopathic one, and it'll be a good start, but I think we'll find that a lot of the topic areas are really quite general, a little bit like the physiotherapy ones were in the early stages of priority development years ago. So, thank you for listening to me. Thank you for thinking with me.